Negotiations can be challenging, and when we're not ready for them, they're even more challenging. In these few slides, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking through what are those things that you need to think through, what kind of data do you need to collect, what kind of arguments do you want to prepare in advance to establish and maintain your credibility throughout the negotiations. So stick with me for the next 20 or so minutes, and hopefully much of what you hear you've heard before, or perhaps you even do currently, but if not, thinking through the negotiation and preparing, gathering data, etc., is probably more important than the negotiation itself. There are 5 stages of negotiation, more or less, and I'm not going to read all the bullets on the slide, there's far too many, but as I mentioned in the start, the most important stage by far is the preparation and planning. And while it may seem obvious that you know what you want when you go into a negotiation, I can't tell you how many times I've come upon people, young, old, highly educated, marginally educated, very successful executives, and yet some will walk into a negotiation unprepared, moreover, not having a real clear idea of what they want. Very quick story. Some years ago, I was teaching an MBA class, and a student came to my office hours about an hour before class and asked for my help. And I said, sure, what can I do for you? And she said, well, I've been with my employer for the last 9 months, and when they hired me, we all agreed that they were paying me below market levels, and that within 6 months' time there would be a review, and we would go ahead and make an adjustment to the salary. So 3 months after that time, this still hadn't happened, and I asked her about it, and she gave me some answer, and then finally I said, well, tell you what, let's just role play. Why don't you come into my office and I'll be your boss. And so she walks in my office and I say, hey, Martha, how can I help you? And she said, well, you know, it's been a few months longer than what we originally agreed to, and I wanted to talk to you about the raise. And so acting as the boss, I said, great. So exactly what is it that you're looking for? And she looked at me kind of stunned and said, more. I kind of held my hands up in the timeout position and I said, okay, we'll stop this role play right now. And in fact, the story goes a little further and I won't bore you with it, but it kind of surprised me then, and it still surprises me now. Many people I speak to, perhaps women a little bit more, but not necessarily, walk into a negotiation not necessarily knowing what they want. And so we're going to spend a little bit of time together really delving into this idea of preparation and planning. You know, in the same way, most of us, if we decide that we're going to drive several hundred miles or states away for a family vacation, we probably wouldn't do it without doing a little bit of planning of where we want to go, in what hotel or campground we'll stay, what kind of amenities would be available to us. And of course, I don't know about you, but I certainly would use my phone by entering the address and knowing where I'm going. So negotiation is quite similar. So what is it that you need to do when you are preparing for a negotiation? As I mentioned, know what you want and why. And back to this example, this story that really happened. What are you looking for? Are you looking for an increase to get you on par with the market? Are you looking for a certain percentage that you feel is warranted because of the contributions you've made to the organization, the amount of money or time that has been saved through some of your innovations, new customers that you've brought into the organization? What is it that you are looking for, and why is it important? Not just because you want to make more money, but what are your interests behind the position of I'm looking for an adjustment of 10% or I'm looking for an adjustment of 20%? And we'll go into a little bit more detail in a moment, but again, while it sounds very simple, I see this as a fairly common mistake. Know what you want and why you want it. What is the goal that you have? What are some of the objectives? And when you do your research and you gather some data, you will have an idea of what market value is, what other people are being paid in similar positions in similar organizations in a similar part of the world, because you might be well aware that pay in San Francisco, for example, is going to be much higher for the same job than pay in Des Moines, Iowa. And so understanding the cost of living and the salary adjustments that would be important before you negotiate is rather critical. Think about your BOTNA, and I will come back to this in a little bit, this best alternative to a negotiated agreement. What I will say right now, though, is that you may hear others talk about a bottom line. What is your bottom line? And that is not a BOTNA. A bottom line is, well, if I get nothing else, I suppose I could put up with this. Why set your sights so low? So bottom line is really, there's no place for it in my view. You haven't been creative enough, you haven't gathered enough data, you haven't really thought through what it is that you want. A BOTNA, a best alternative, is really sifting through the possibilities that would meet your interests and prioritizing them. You want to develop a concrete strategy, not just, okay, I'm going to think for 5 minutes on my commute in, these are the things that I'm looking for, but rather something written, something thoughtful, something that may include some combination of these components. Not only what do you want and why, but what do you think your opponent or your negotiating partner might be interested in? Where are they coming from? What are the things that they're trying to achieve in this negotiation? What assumptions might they have? Now, let me clarify these two terms, position and interests. A position is a stake that you claim. I want to pay no more than $1,000. That's a position. Or I'm looking for a 10% increase in pay. I want to spend no more than $20,000 on a nearly new but not brand new car. Those are positions. Interests are different. Whereas the position is the what and interest is the why. Why do you want to pay no more than X? Is there a budget issue? Is there some other consideration that you have? What are the costs of ownership, total ownership, for example, when we're talking about a car? So understanding that there are interests behind positions is a very important concept in negotiation, because it enables two or more parties to actually find commonality. Sometimes our positions are so wide apart and we are so stuck in our positions, and the current political environment notwithstanding, that we don't even attempt to find commonality, because we take a position, we take a stand, and we may be standing very far apart from one another, but without really understanding why people want what they want. It's a little different. And to put it in terms of, on a contracting basis, when you're negotiating a contract with a vendor, for example, of course we want best quality, the best price, the best delivery, highest quality, all these different things that we want, but they may not be equally important. And so understanding what your interests are. So for example, the time by which you receive these items is going to be much more important than the cost, because you already have back orders. Customers are looking for this product and it's partially assembled but not completely assembled because this vendor has the product that you need. And so understanding the interests, like, okay, more than anything, I need to get this product on time, and therefore I'd be willing to pay a little bit more. I'd be willing to step up a higher level of quality if it means that I can get it at a certain time, or maybe stepping down a certain level. So these are the interests behind the position. Another thing you should plan prior to walking into a negotiation is to think about, how can I make myself and what it is that I am presenting, my goals and objectives in the negotiation, credible? And credibility is a very big topic. There are a lot of things that go into credibility. One has to do with your knowledge and expertise of what it is that you're negotiating. So, again, if it's one of those 10 minutes on my way to my location, I'll think about it, you probably won't appear credible. When somebody questions you about some of the specifications of the products or the delivery, or the components that are part of the products and what they're made of, if you're not well versed in it, you're not going to appear credible. Part of credibility is saying what you mean and meaning what you say, and it doesn't mean making it up when you don't know. If somebody asks you a question and you just kind of BS your way through it, you might get away with that. You might not get caught, but trust me, when the other party finds out that you lied or exaggerated, or just kind of said something that sounded ballpark, when that trust is broken, and if the other person thinks that you made this information up or lied maliciously, the trust might not ever be repaired. So think about what it is you want, research well, dress the part, which kind of goes without saying, and really be clear about your convictions so that you can develop trust with the other party and work together to find a resolution that both parties can agree to. Thinking ahead of time, what questions do I want to ask? So without going into a lot of detail about some ethical lapses that we see in negotiation, there are sins of omission and sins of commission, right? And so commission is when somebody asks you a question directly and you directly lie. You specifically cover up or sort of skim around the issue and talk about something else because you've been cornered. And most would agree that that's a worse crime, a worse sin than the sin of omission, which was, well, nobody asked me and I didn't think it was appropriate to offer up the information. When you think ahead of time, what are the questions that I want to ask the other party? And especially if you can develop the questions that are open and open-ended and searching for information, as opposed to, you wouldn't want to trick us, would you? I mean, sure, that is a question, but it is a leading question. It's one that kind of puts the other party on the defense. So questions that help you understand better the products, the processes, the relationship, the way in which parties will work together over the course of the contract. Think ahead what those questions are, write them down, and think about arguments that you want to present to strengthen your case. So again, these are all things that you think about ahead of time. In the negotiations that I simulate in classes with executives and master's students, the concrete strategies that are developed are often 45 minutes or more worth of time, depending on how complex the negotiation is. The other thing that you can do, when you're spending time thinking about your negotiation, is think ahead of time. What are some possible and creative ways that both I and the other party can get what we want? And again, this really comes back to digging below the surface of the what, or the position, to the why, which are the interests. When you take educated guesses, when you know the other party, or you know the company that the other party represents and what they tend to care most about, you can ahead of time think through potential solutions that would actually benefit both parties. And you might be thinking, well, that's on them. I'm going to negotiate harder, I'm going to win. If they're going to spend the time preparing, well, then they should do that too. But this is not a competition. If you can think through, well, what are some very creative ways? And by creative, what I mean by that is looking at the contract not necessarily as a fixed contract, perhaps, but as a variable contract. We'll pay X up to the first 500 units, and then a 2%, 5% discount on the next number of units. The idea of, for example, 210 net 30, right? So if you pay early, you get a discount. When you start experimenting with time and percentages and other combinations of ownership, you can really find solutions that both parties could walk away from a negotiation and feeling as though they've won. And that's typically a bar worth shooting for, because nowadays our negotiations tend not to be one-offs. They tend to be a series of conversations with a vendor, with a supplier, with an internal customer or employee. And so thinking about the relationship between the two parties as being at least as important as the thing that you're negotiating for helps reframe what negotiations are all about. I like to think of them as problem-solving sessions, that you and the other party have a problem, and that if you work together, if you think about shared interests, if you think about creative ways of resolving the conflict, you can problem solve to a solution. Another thing that is important to consider is, how will we know that the solution meets our needs down the line? And how will we know if we're getting a fair deal once we sign on the dotted line? And objective criteria is something to consider. And frankly, there are a lot of options out there. So, if you're selling a house, you've got the comps. Those are objective criteria to measure against the house that you perhaps try to sell private party. Legal issues, precedent, contracts, hiring, firing, things like that. Those may also be the kind of objective criteria that might be relevant in a particular negotiation. And the thing is, unlike years ago, nowadays, so much of this information is readily available online. 30 years ago, if you were buying a home, it was only the real estate agent that really had access to the MLS, the multiple listing service, and would be able to kind of print out in the office on the dot matrix printer all the homes that met the criteria that you specified. Well, now all that data are available to the average person. The same is the case for car buying. The same is the case for salaries and things like that. So when you and the opposing party can agree on the measuring stick, it makes finding a solution easier. But if you haven't communicated what that measuring stick is, if you are both operating under different sets of assumptions, it'll make finding a solution that works for everybody that much more difficult. And then finally, still keeping in mind that this is some of the things that you might include on a strategy. Sometimes this process will be much more complicated, involve many more people, and possibly even we start thinking about cultural differences when we look at different companies and different countries in which they may be headquartered. So finally, think about an agenda that you might propose going into the negotiation, and propose as opposed to insist on, right? So what is the plan for the time that we have together? Do we want to talk about issues A, B, and C? Do we want to talk about what the nature of our working relationship is going to be? Do we want to spend 5 minutes on the end of the agenda, wrapping things up and clarifying what the next steps are? So considering an agenda that you'll propose and be willing to negotiate any changes to that agenda, but having that set plan for how you'll spend your time is a really good way to start. In order to illustrate this concept of bhatna, I'd like to get you to think about your current car. Imagine that this is the car that you bought many years ago, perhaps after you graduated from college, and the car is, well, on its last legs. So you decide that this Saturday you're going to go to the neighborhood car dealership and get yourself a new car. If it sounds a little daunting to you, I'm not surprised. Women on average pay $1,353 more than men for cars. And that is holding constant the car, the make, the part of the country, etc. So I'm not trying to dissuade you, but as I mentioned, when we prepare ahead of time, we have a greater chance of going into the negotiation with greater confidence, and also to get through the negotiation more effectively, more successfully. So what is the best alternative to a negotiated agreement? As I said, it's not the same as a bottom line. Well, to think about that, let's go back to this car. You may think, well, I'm walking into this dealership to buy a car and I have X amount of money to spend. But actually, is that your interest? If you think more generically, your interest is getting to and from work, getting from point A to point B. And depending on where you live, there may be options that are worth considering. A new car is expensive, and as you know, the cost of the car is not inclusive of the cost of ownership. Costs money for insurance and repairs and gas and various service requirements, for some that are inexpensive and some that are very expensive, new tires, etc. So thinking about that, actually, when you have a need to get from point A to point B, a bigger set of opportunities or options might include the train. It might include Ubering. It might include a subscription to Car2Go, or maybe if you're, somebody who cares a lot about health and exercise, maybe you buy a very high quality bicycle, and at least certain times of the year, as long as it's not raining or snowing, you not only save money on gas, but you get a great workout, if it's possible. There may be other options too. You might be able to beg a ride from a friend, or there's a carpool within the company, etc. So if the goal is, how do I get from point A to point B, a car becomes one of many options. So in order to think through the bhatna in this particular case, you would invent this list of what are the possible outcomes that would suffice, would help me meet my needs, address the interests I have, if no contract is signed today on this car. Think about it. The problem that often happens is our emotions get the better of us. We see this beautiful car, or we hear from the salesperson that this is a deal like none other. Once you leave today, you'll never get a deal like this again, blah, 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 right? But when you've done your homework, when you've thought about all the options that would get you from point A to point B, including maybe a phased in plan, well, I'm willing to spend the next month Ubering or carpooling with a friend if that's what it takes to find the perfect car that I want. So by looking at this list of actions, thinking about the more promising ideas for you, given your constraints and your needs, and then thinking through those alternatives by prioritizing and picking the one or the top two that seem the best. When you do this, you can walk on this lot with a feeling of peace that says, hey, if I don't get the deal that I want, paying the amount of money that I want to get the features in the car that I want, I don't need to buy this car, and I certainly don't need to buy this car today. Imagine the weight off your shoulders. So this idea of a bhatna is important for you to think through just as much as it's important for you to imagine what the other partner's bhatna is, because as I said, it's not the bottom line, it's not that low bar, it's really a quite high bar. And thinking of it ahead of time gives you that sense of, I know where I am, that tripwire, I know where that tripwire is, and I know if it's starting to look like it's moving in a direction that's not working for me, it's easy to say, hey, thanks a lot for your time. This deal isn't going to happen today, and take care. Bye. So we'll talk more about this in our session, but I wanted to give you a little overview of this. So I mentioned a number of these components that you might see in a negotiating strategy. And I've really talked about most of these, and I will provide an outline for you in this seminar. But taking a look at this list, you'll see a lot of the things that we talked about. Also, talked a little bit about credibility. How do I enhance my credibility? How do I enhance the strength of my arguments? We'll spend a little time talking about persuasion theory. And there's been a lot of wonderful research in this area that can help you ahead of time think about the arguments you want to present to strengthen the goals that you set out in the negotiation. And notice too in the proposed agenda, not only is there a content component, like how should we start and what are some of the things we should include, but there's also kind of this process, thinking about process. Can we start the negotiation in a way that frames it positively? And again, this may sound like, well, I'll just wing it when I get there, but here's the thing. Many a negotiation is an opportunity to find a resolution for a conflict. You are looking to spend as little money as possible. Vendor is looking to make as much money as possible. You start in a position of conflict. So by framing the negotiation, by kind of setting out expectations like, hey, Jan, I know you and I have worked together on a number of different negotiations between our companies, and we have found good solutions in the past. I imagine today will be no different. So how do you think we can get off on the right foot on this negotiation? So, just some things to think about. As I said, depending on the negotiation that is in front of you, how complicated it is, the other issues that may exist, the financial ramifications, the legal aspects that must be covered in the contract, as well as the financial aspects, whether or not there's one team that is agreeing on the actual negotiation, but another team that is implementing the strategy. These are all considerations, but I did want to spend a little bit of time getting you to think about, if I walk into a negotiation, what are some of the things that I will spend some time on preparing in order to increase not only the likelihood of success, but also your confidence going into the negotiation. If you've ever impulse bought a car or some other item because you were kind of in the moment, you, I'm sure, recognize the importance of taking time ahead of time before your emotions jump in the way of your logic. This is a process of thinking through, what do you want? Why do you want it? What is a bhatna? And how can you help yourself get to what it is that you're looking for?